Anti-government protests have swept across Iran in reaction to the death of a 22-year-old woman in the custody of the regime's morality police. It happened after she was arrested for not wearing the required hijab or head covering.
There are reports she was beaten on the head with a baton. Amini fell into a coma shortly after being arrested and died 3 days later.
The people of Iran are protesting in the streets after the so-called morality police killed a woman for refusing to cover her head. I'm Yasmin Khan with Rebel HQ, and the woman, 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, was arrested by the morality police for having an inadequate head covering according to the mandates of the Iranian government. Amini died in their custody 3 days after her arrest, leading to protests throughout the nation, primarily led by women but supported by men. As of me recording this, it's being reported that 7 protesters have been killed by government forces since the protest started several days ago, with nearly 100 more injured and over 200 arrested. Kurdish-owned businesses across Iran are also closing their doors and going on strike in response to the death of Amini, who was herself Kurdish. Anger over Amini's death and everything it represents, the patriarchal oppression of women in a religiously led republic, motivated women to take off their own headscarves in solidarity, some burning their headscarves publicly, some cutting their hair publicly. They want the freedom to live their lives as they best see fit, provided they're not hurting anyone, which is all anyone ever wants in these types of situations. Now, discussing Iran is sometimes hard to do without giving a bit of cultural and historical background, so I will do that now. So after World War I, the Ottoman Empire, which comprised much of the Middle East, fell, eventually giving rise to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran. Notably, Saudi Arabia is comprised of Arabs and Iranians are Persian. There's also a religious difference between the two nations of people. While both nations are Muslim, Saudi Arabian Muslims are Sunni, as are the majority of Muslims worldwide, and Iranian Muslims are Shia, the minority group within the Islamic world. Those sects of Islam aren't terribly different from each other, and for the most part, the two sects have gotten along reasonably well throughout their histories. The issues between Iran and Saudi Arabia go beyond religious differences, though. They're political. Both nations have a ton of oil, but where Saudi Arabia was allowed to thrive following its discovery in the late 1930s, Iran had to deal with foreign intervention, specifically from the UK, the US, and Russia. For instance, the UK set up an oil company in Iran that would eventually come to be known as BP. Iran was even invaded and occupied at one point by both the UK and Russia, and in the 1950s, the Iranians saw their leader overthrown in a US-backed coup and replaced by a Shah who was sympathetic to the West. But that was part of the problem. He was a little too sympathetic to the West. The Iranians began to feel that their own ancient Persian culture was taking a backseat to Americanism. But still, the nation was doing all right economically, and the Shah had put in several progressive reforms for the time. Unfortunately, those high points weren't enough to counter the lows, like rampant government corruption and the use of secret police. The Iranians eventually revolted against the Shah in the 1979 Iranian Revolution. The Shah was replaced by Ayatollah Khomeini, a religious leader who declared Iran to be a legitimate Shia Muslim nation. He was less enamored by westernization than his predecessor was, but with this new guy in charge, Iran posed a more significant threat to Saudi Arabia's hold on the Muslim world. Long story short, the two nations engaged in a decades-long Middle Eastern Cold War in order to prevent one's ideology from spreading too rampantly throughout the region. Of course, nothing is ever as simple as that, and the situation in the Middle East has been made all the more complicated over the years by foreign intervention from the US and Russia, oil money, monarchies, militias, nuclear weapons, and more. With all of that, stability in Iran has been hard to come by for extended periods of time, especially when you consider that the revolution only took place a few decades ago, and when you consider that a lot more has happened in that region than what I've mentioned in this one video. While a lot of that instability was motivated by religion, it had more to do with economic and political factors and the spaces where religion and politics overlap. Should the government be allowed to jail women and strip them of opportunities because they're dressing in a way that the government deems un-Islamic? Or should the government just let women live their lives? It's kind of funny because we talk about these foreign nations whose values tend to be very different from our own, but we still see and judge their issues through our own American lens. That tends to be a limiting factor for us because we can underestimate how significantly cultural and religious ideals can permeate a nation of people. in many ways, some of which are probably inexplicable. They don't see the world the way that we do. But on the flip side of that argument, people are people. And not to get all philosophical on you, but it's good to periodically question whether your concepts of good and evil are actually as universal and culturally transcendent as you perceive them to be. In this particular case, American women are in a position to sympathize with the women of Iran, as the women of both countries have seen their rights stripped from them and their physical bodies reduced to political fodder in the name of religious zealotry and bigotry. And I'm not trying to draw a false equivalency here, nor am I trying to be hyperbolic. Obviously, life here is still very different from life over there, but on this particular issue, there's definitely a sense of solidarity to be felt between the two groups. So maybe we're not so different from one another. Now, on a personal note, I was raised Muslim, but my family was never terribly religious, and it's not really a part of our lives these days. Personally, I've been disillusioned with organized religion in general for quite some time, probably since my early teens, but I did grow up around a lot of deeply religious people, so it was part of my life for much longer than I actually cared about it. It was a community thing, which is arguably one of the better things I think organized religion has to offer people, arguably. Now, within that community, though, most of the girls wore the hijab and adhered to a relatively strict dress code. If they liked dressing that way and they wanted to dress that way, fine. I had no problems with it then. I don't have any problems with it now. And if you were to ask different women why they wear the hijab, you're gonna get a variety of different answers from them. It's a very personal thing, or at least it's supposed to be. It's always puzzled me, though, because I looked in the Quran and never saw where it said that women had to cover themselves to the extent that these Islamic nations are mandating. At best, it says that women should cover their bosom, which is basically saying to dress in a way that's respectful and modest. All this stuff where absolutely no hair can be showing on a woman, or that the only part of her that should be visible is her eyes, or that she needs to be shrouded in black anytime she's out in public, and I know I wear a lot of black, but that's a personal choice. It's not the religion. That's just your run-of-the-mill, boring, old-fashioned patriarchy and misogyny. The problem is that since there are Islamic nations, specifically with Saudi Arabia portraying itself as the heart of the Islamic world, the mandates of that nation often get conflated with religious mandates. None of the women in this community that I was a part of were Saudi, but a lot of them dressed like they were. Someone's relationship with the divine, however you perceive it, define it, or conceptualize it, is such a personal thing, and that relationship is constantly changing. The idea that it can be codified within a nation of laws and imposed upon a nation of people is utterly ridiculous, and any government that is able to pull it off successfully is doing so through oppressive measures. Policing belief systems does not work because governments can't read minds, however much they try to. People just want to live, and really, Iran, who cares what's on a woman's head? It'd be a lot easier if Iran's government, and our government for that matter, would just get over the fact that women are a thing. And rather than oppressing women, imagine the progress that could be made if women were embraced and empowered instead. All right, that's it for me. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you got something out of this content, and follow me over on Instagram and TikTok. Thanks so much.